Hello, dear friends. Today we're starting a new session, a new meeting of organized by the Center of Women's Studies of the Ukrainian Catholic University. And today we are having a special guest, Eulalia Piñero Gil. She lives in Spain and she teaches at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. And I'm happy to present Eulalia because we met some time ago before the war when we were doing a special conference dedicated to Lesa Ukrainka. And Eulalia Piñero Gil was so kind to join our group and to tell an excellent story about Emilio Pardo Bazán. And today I want to say that Eulalia Piñero Gil is associate professor in American literature and gender studies at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Currently, she's the head of the Department of English department at this university. She was awarded a scholarship to study comparative literature at Purdue University, where she graduated with a master's degree in 1987. Likewise, she was awarded a doctoral grant to research the archive of the American poet Marianne Moore at the Rosenbach Library and Foundation in Philadelphia. Eulalia Piñero Gil was also granted 2 scholarships by the Canadian government to research Canadian women's poetry in 1997 and in 1998. She has published she has published extensively in women's literature, gender studies, music and literature, American and Canadian poetry, Asian American and African American literatures, American theater, and 19th century American literature. Notably, she has co-edited several works, including Visions of Canada Approaching the Millennium, 1999, Women and Art, Visions of Change and Social Development, 2010, Breaking a Sea of Silence, Interdisciplinary Reflections on Gender Violence, 2013, and is the author of the critical edition of Extraordinary Narrations by Edgar Allan Poe, and the translation and critical edition of Herman Melville's Bartleby, the Scrivener, in the editorial Espasa Calpe 2006. And today's presentation is extremely interesting. It is about Edith Wharton and her short story, Kerfol. I'm so glad to give the floor to our special guest. Please.
Thank you, Alexander. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello from Madrid. I'm really thrilled to be here today. I would like to thank Professor Olga Malecka and, of course, Professor Alexander Pronkiewicz for organizing this lecture. I'm really happy to be here today and to meet with my friends, especially with Alexander, and see you all safe and sound. Thank you so much to the students of the Catholic University and to my students at the one who have joined us today. And I have also a special greetings from Ukrainians in Madrid. A group of them were demonstrating in Madrid the other day, and I met some of them, and they say, please say hello from us Ukrainians in Madrid. And I'll say, don't worry, I'll do it. Well, as Professor Pronkiewicz was saying, I'm lecturing today on one of the most fascinating American female writers, Edith Wharton, and more specifically on her wonderful short story, Kerfol. Let me briefly give you some information about Edith Newbold Jones. That was her maiden name. She was the only daughter in a select conservative and all New York family. Her parents, George Frederick and Lucretia Stevens, belonged to an elite social class that prided itself on its avoidance of ostentation, intellectualism, and emotion. In fact, Edith's progenitors were very cold and distant with her. Their plans for Edith had nothing to do with their daughter's literary ambition and with her voracious and secret passion, reading and the family's library. And here you have a picture of Edith Wharton with two of her favorite dogs. No, she was a dog lover all her life. So, as I was saying, Edith Jones was educated at home by a German governess, and her childhood was a very lonely one. Like most of the young and affluent ladies of her social class, she made her debut at the age of 17. Some critics have suggested that her personal life was troubled by the difficult relationship she had with her parents. Her controlling mother became a kind of Calvinist god, according to one of her biographers, Gloria Ehrlich. Needless to say, her controlling and distant attitude lacked the emotional bond any child needs for a balanced life. It seems that Lucretia Stevens limited most of her maternal energies to setting for female offspring a proper example in dress, manner, and the use of the English language. In fact, Wharton's mother would not allow her daughter to read novels until she was married to Teddy Wharton. Fortunately, there was some light in Edith's emotional life because her nanny, Hannah Doyle, became a kind of surrogate mother. Her influence was so important in Edith's childhood that Doyle, as she was known, appears in Wharton's autobiography, A Backward Glance, and she pays a significant tribute to her memory. And I quote, "How I pity all children who have not had a doily, a nurse who had always been there, who is as established as the sky and as warm as the sun, who understands everything, can arrange everything, and combines all the powers of the divinity with the compassion of a mortal heart like one's own. Doyley's presence was a kind of warm cocoon in which my infancy lived safe and sheltered. The atmosphere without which I could not have breathed. It is thanks to Doyle that no one bitter memory, one incomprehensible injustice, darkened the days when the soul's flesh is so tender, and the remembrance of wrongs so acute." End of quote. As it might be inferred from Wharton's warm words, Doyle was a real mother for her, and the emotional impact she had on the writer's existence was lasting and really influential in her affective life. Another aspect that emerges from Wharton's autobiography is the one that consistently associates her father with literature, and more specifically with poetry. Therefore, the shy Edith retreated to her father's library, and there the young girl was happy as she rediscovered the books that were to sustain her solitary life. She confessed in her autobiography that this experience was, quote, "a secret ecstasy of communion." She also said that without her father's library, my mind, quote, "my mind would have starved at the age when mental muscles are most in need of feeding," end of quote. However, her strong literary enthusiasm puzzled her family and their circle of anti-intellectual, superficial, and unimaginative friends. In other words, Edith had to struggle against a social context that disregarded her passion for literature and writing. This fact had consequences for her adult life, as Gloria Ehrlich has argued. The novelist struggled to repair the emotional damage of her childhood, and in my view, her literature reflects on these experiences. Like most young women of that period, she was expected to marry, And in fact, she married a wealthy Bostonian, Edward Teddy Wharton, in 1885, a good-natured man 13 years her senior. That was a very conventional marriage that turned out really unhappy because of Teddy's infidelities, and later his mental health deteriorated because it seems he was bipolar. The couple had no children and their lives separated. The unhappiness Wharton experienced in her marriage and her husband's serial infidelities found a dark expression in her ghostly fiction. Therefore, the implications of adultery are a common theme in her short stories. It seems that Edith had a secret love affair with a younger man named Morton Fullerton, a journalist that at least understood her passions. In 1910, Wharton moved to France permanently, where she began a new life. The country she chose to make her home offered freedom, a historical past, the monuments and gardens she was looking for, and above all, a society that was liberal and non-judgmental. In Paris, she also had a very important relationships with Camille Chabert, an opera singer, and Mercedes Acosta, a Brazilian poet. In fact, the set of our story today is France, Brittany, okay? So Wharton, above all, loved her new life in France. Her personal compromise with the country of adoption was really strong, as she devoted herself to hospital and charity work during the Great War. In 1916, Wharton won France's highest decoration, La Légion d'honneur. In 1921, she was also the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature for The Age of Innocence. In 1923, she was the first woman to be honored by Yale University with the degree of Doctor of Letters. Interestingly enough, she was the highest paid novelist in the US. A commemorative plaque reminds Parisians that she lived in France for the last 25 years of her life. She died in France in 1937 and is buried in the Cimetière des Gonards at Versailles. Edith Wharton, the dog lover. Scholars and biographers have suggested that Wharton, who had a troubled and childless marriage, substituted dogs for children, which may have some truth to it, but only some, since her love of canine companions started at the age of 4, when her father gave her a Spitz called Foxy, a dog who she later said made me into a conscious, sentient person. In this sense, Teresa Gomez Reus, a Spanish scholar, rightly notes that, quote, Wharton had a passionate relationship with dogs and the sounds of words. The truth is that dogs probably provided her with comfort and companion through her troubled marriage, a nervous breakdown, a brief affair, frequent trips back and forth to Europe, a divorce, and the end of her life in the south of France. The Mount was Wharton's home in Lenox, Massachusetts. It has a pet cemetery with 6 little gravestones on a wooden hill, marking the graves of Mimi, Toto, Misa, and Jules, 4 of the dozen of dogs Wharton had over her lifetime. Wharton could see the cemetery from her window, and she wrote, always surrounded by her living dogs and gazing out at the dead. Visitors say that since Wharton's death, numerous ghosts have been sighted at the Mount, including ghostly canines, a few of which have been photographed by guests, or so they say. So unfortunately, Teddy Wharton spent a large portion of her trust fund, thus forcing the sale of the Mount. There are many pictures of Wharton showing her elaborate dressings, and she's always accompanied by 1 or 2 of her many small dogs she loved, her Pomeranians and Pekingeses. In 1920, she published a series of lyrical epigrams in the Yale Review, the first of which reads, quote, "My little old dog, a heartbeat at my feet." Another dimension of Edith Wharton's connection with animals in general was that she became an animal activist. Oops, excuse me. Both Wharton and her husband Teddy were founding members of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and were active in a campaign to outfit the New York City streets with drinking bowls for dogs. Curiously, she also frequently hired a dog knitter to make sweaters for her pets. In her unpublished autobiographical essay, Life and I, she wrote, quote, I always had a deep instinctive understanding of animals, a yearning to hold them in my arms, a fierce desire to protect them against pain and cruelty. These feelings seem to have its source in a curious sense of being somehow, myself, an intermediate creature between human beings and animals, and nearer, on the whole, to the furry tribes than to Homo sapiens. I felt that I know things about them, their sensations, desires, and sensibilities, that other bipeds could not guess, and this seemed to lay on me the obligation to defend them against their human oppressors. In a diary she began in May 1924, she also reveals, quote, I am secretly afraid of animals, of all animals except dogs, and even of some dogs. I think it is because of the usness in their eyes, with the underlying not usness which belies it. And is so tragic a reminder of the lost age when we human beings branched off and left them to the eternal inarticulateness and slavery. Why? Their eyes seem to ask us. In 1937, when her favorite dog Linky died, Wharton wrote to William Royal Tyler, a US diplomat, that she had always understood what dogs said. Quote, I have always been like that about dogs. Ever since I was a baby, we really communicated with each other, and no one has such wise things to say as Linky. As we have seen, Wharton's dogs provided the writer constant companion, emotional support, and stability in her life. Some of her biographers have pointed out that she developed her lifelong routine of writing in bed with her dogs beside her. Moreover, as we have seen in the previous quotations, she shows powerful feelings towards dogs and animals in general. Clearly, Edith Wharton loved dogs, and although she seldom included them in her fiction, I think that her story, Kerfol, is a great example of her artistry as a writer and of her devotion to dogs. In my view, most of the testimonies I have just read are crucial to interpret the story, as we will see later. And now let's focus on Kerfol, the story that I am going to analyze. Literary critics have considered Wharton a novelist of manners, as anti-modernist, as a member of the school of Henry James, or even as a woman writer. According to Janet Beer, she was writing as a professional, but also as an artist who was the heir to a complicated set of regional and aesthetic precedents and was seeking the best means of assimilation as well as innovation. Kerfol is a ghost story, and it is part of Wharton's outstanding contribution to the Gothic American genre. The writer was a believer in ghosts, Gothic stories, and their emotional power. She enjoyed reading them as well as writing these kind of supernatural stories, and was obsessed by the supernatural and the terror it could summon forth out of the darkness. For American writers like Wharton, the ghost story was an ideal vehicle for revealing the social ills present in American culture and society. In fact, most of these stories are often interpreted as critiques of paternalist and patriarchal marriage that produces and regulates gender and sexuality. And they tend to focus on women's silence by patriarchal power, as Kathy Bethorko and Jenny Diamond have suggested. Kerfol first appeared in Scribner's and then in Shingu and Other Stories in 1916, although it was written before the Great War. The meaning of Kerfol in Breton is House of Madness. Wharton also makes an oral connection between the pronunciation of the word in Breton and Kerfol in English. The tale we're going to analyze today is a very significant one in the Gothic core of Wharton's work. In fact, she has a book of ghost stories, which has been widely analyzed. At the same time, it is a kind of literary homage to the relevant role dogs played in her life. I was going to read the plot of the story, but I imagine that you all have read the story. So I'm going to skip that. So Wharton's Kerfol is her only work in which dogs appear in primary roles, even though critics have traditionally overlooked the role in the story. According to Jennifer Haytuck, the story, quote, invites a reading of her portrayal of the relationship between humans and animals. In the story, dogs appear in a multifaceted, multi-signifying system as symbols, ghosts, and actual dogs. Kerfol not only encompasses a turning point in the historical debate about the relationship between humans and animals, but also attempts to reconcile Wharton's feelings of kinship with and fear of dogs in the ghostly representation as the victims of class and gender privilege and as the executors of vengeance on behalf of the silent. In this story, she also tackles the problem of being taken seriously as a writer while addressing a subject not considered serious, the love of gods. Human beings who love dogs or animals in general show a compelling variety of excessive emotions. We have all experienced those emotions and they are very difficult to describe. But what we all know is that we need to protect them and we think that they deserve a good and a happy life. In Kerfol, dogs are the victims of Yves de Cornol's cruelty and violence against his wife. Anne is unable to protect them, and she also becomes a vicarious victim of that punishing violence. As readers, we have to read the dogs as dogs and the ghosts of the dogs as ghosts of dogs. But apart from this important idea, my reading of the story takes into account the emotions and feelings of the human and non-human protagonist of the story. Wharton's Kerfol is a compelling testimony of how the protagonist emotionally face the ordeals of a distant time. Similarly, the story offers insight into so many features of human and animal behavior of a specific past and present, and the ways it sticks to their embodied experiences. In this regard, Sarah Ahmed has convincingly argued in The Cultural Politics of Emotion that, quote, emotions tell us a lot about time. Emotions are the very flesh of time. They show us the time it takes to move or to move on, and is a time that exceeds the time of an individual life. Through emotions, the past persists on the surface of bodies. Emotions show us how histories stay alive, even when they are not consciously remembered, how histories of colonialism, slavery, and violence shapes lives and worlds in the present. The time of emotion is not always about the past and how it sticks. Emotions are also open up futures in the ways they involve different orientations to others. It takes time to know what we can do with emotion, end of quote. It is important to mention here that Wharton set the tragedy of the Cornwalls in the 16th century, but she framed her tale with a 20th century perspective on animals. She knew the story would be read by a 20th century audience and the role of dogs would resonate differently for the story's characters and its readers. Before moving into the analysis of the short story, it will be helpful to define the theoretical grounds of my inquiry and the terminology I use for this purpose, and in so doing draw a connection between the theories of cultural philosopher and feminist Sarah Ahmed and the scientific breakthroughs and discoveries of neuroscientist Antonio Damasio. On the one hand, and I have just pointed out, Ahmed focuses on the relationship between emotions, language, and bodies and their social cultural representations from a feminist perspective. She also investigates them as collective corporeal expressions which materialize and circulate between the individual and social bodies. Therefore, Ahmed develops a new methodology for reading the emotionality of texts, where it is fundamental to study the real impact emotions have in society. On the other hand, Damasio concludes that the body is the origin of emotions, and the mental experiences they create are feelings that are always hidden, like all mental images necessarily are. Thus, for the neuroscientist, emotions and feelings play a crucial role in social cognition and decision-making processes. In addition, cognitive processes always have a corporeal basis, and he suggests that, quote, emotions play out in the theater of the body and feelings play out in the theater of the mind. In this lecture, I refer to primary or basic emotions as described by Damasio, who considers, quote, emotions to be actions or movements, many of them public, visible to others as they occur in the face, in the voice, in a specific behavior. And the frequent listing of emotions includes fear, anger, disgust, surprise, sadness, and happiness. In the case of social emotions, Damasio included sympathy, embarrassment, shame, guilt, pride, jealousy, envy, gratitude, admiration, indignation, and contempt. In the same way, the neurologist argues that a feeling is, quote, the perception of a certain state of the body along with the perception of a certain mode of thinking and of thoughts with certain themes, and concludes that, quote, feelings translate the ongoing life state in the language of the mind. Now I'll, with this theoretical framework that I have just explained, the theories of cultural philosopher Ahmed and the theories, well, the research also of Antonio Damasio on feelings and emotions, I would like to analyze the story. And I have entitled the first part of my analysis, The Sympathetic Unnamed Narrator. The unnamed narrator of Kerfol is a sympathetic reader to Ernst de Barrigan's sufferings. He also understands the dog's emotional state. He interprets the cause of their suffering in terms of what would matter in the emotional life of a dog, a lack of human attention. The narrator's sympathy for the dogs proves his humanity, and his response to the dogs prepares the reader to sympathize with Anne de Barrigan. There are many examples of his affective behavior in the story. Now I have brought here on this slide 3 quotations, like the first one. The little animal stood before me, forbidding, almost menacing. There was anger in his large brown eyes. This is the moment in which he is for the very first time in Kerfol, and a dog barred his way, okay? I had a feeling that they, the dogs, must be horribly cold to be so silent and inert, yet they did not look hungry or ill-treated. Their coats were smooth and they were not thin, except the shivering greyhound. It was more as if they had lived a long time with people who never spoke to them or looked at them, as though the silence of the place had gradually benumbed their busy, inquisitive natures. And this strange passivity, this almost human lassitude, seemed to me sadder than the misery of starved and beaten animals. The dogs knew better. They knew what the house would tolerate and what it would not. In my view, the narrator clearly represents 20th century views on animals, and more specifically on dogs. It seems to me that he's able to communicate with them through the emotional expression of their eyes, and to see them as subjects in themselves with sensations, desires, and sensibilities. I think he actively responds to the emotions he perceives in the dogs of Kerfol. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit about Anne de Barrigan, the victim of this marital Gothic, right? Wharton's Kerfol is a story that reflects in a powerful way about the role and importance of emotions and feelings. In this context of isolation in the prototypical Gothic mansion, the female protagonist, Anne de Barrigan, is a victim of her pathologically jealous and cruel husband. As Damasio points out in his research on affect, jealousy is a social emotion. In my view, it is one of the most toxic and damaging social emotions that might destroy relationships and condemn the protagonists to unhappiness and annihilation. Thus, Anne de Barrigan has to deal with her husband's destructive emotions, and she tries to survive in what Michel Massé calls a marital Gothic. In this context, she's also denied a voice within her marriage, and later before the law, she lacks human emotional support, and what is worse, she's trapped by fear, sadness, and disgust about her husband's cruel and violent behavior. Therefore, Anne de Barrigan projects her suppressed and repressed desire and affection onto her pets, her dogs. The narrator repeats many times that her married life, quote, had been extremely lonely and desolate, that her husband kept her like a prisoner at Kerfol. Furthermore, she tries to convince the jury about her fear, and she constantly repeats that she's terrified. Quote, I was afraid for my life, of my husband, because he had strangled my little dog. According to Damasio, fear is one of the most important emotions, and Anne lives terrified by her husband. She feels a deep anxiety about being strangled or attacked by her cruel master. Then you would have us believe that you that your husband. Okay, I cannot see this. Okay, I'll skip that part. When Eve strangles her first dog and wraps the lost necklet, which is obviously a symbol of her bondage, around its neck, and knows this to be a chilling warning for her to remain faithful to her master. Likewise, the narrator informs the reader that Anne has serious doubts about the fate of her friend Herbert de Larivant. She feels sure that her husband probably killed her friend as she asks him to take her away from her prison. When Anne is taken to court to testify, she confirms that the dogs murdered her husband, her dead dogs. But the jury cannot comprehend her unhappiness. They cannot hear her story of emotional trauma when it involves acts of commission, and those of omission simply do not exist for them. Her discourse is exclusively other, incomprehensible to the hegemonic discourse of male authority that only recognizes voices echoing masculine desire. As a woman in patriarchal society, Anne is treated as a child by her husband and her judges. And as a woman who loves dogs, she is marked as doubly childish. Hayton has also suggested that, quote, the secret passion of Kerfol is not Anne's alleged love affair with Hervé de Larivant, but rather her love for her dogs. Reading Anne's grief for her dogs literally, rather than as code for a frustrated love affair, allows the reader to take Wharton's own attachment to animals seriously. Eve the Cournot, or the Gothic villain. The lord of the domain of Kerfol is Eve de Cournot, a 62-year-old nobleman who is a prototypical Gothic villain. He is a menacing husband who terrorizes his wife and servants and vicariously kills Anne by murdering her beloved dogs. The husband's great love is defined by his violent jealousy and his seclusion of his young wife in his castle. He considers Anne his most prized possession, and when he's away on business, he would order his servants to guard her so that she was not allowed to even walk alone in the garden. He lacks any emotional sympathy towards her wife or the dogs. His cruel behavior towards animals makes him a not fully moral being, and his treatment of Anne as part of the same vein of immorality. The narrator describes his cruelty with the following words. But that day he had a peasant hanged for stealing a fagot in the park, and the next day he nearly beat to death a young horse he was breaking. If the Cournot's castle is a symbolic representation of his power and control over his wife and servants, the isolation and sadness that its inhabitants experience show how Wharton conceived the domestic realm as a living space. Therefore, we could say that the castle is a prison house of unhappiness and sorrow that hides the tragedy of the Cournot's story of violence. The dogs of Kerfol, or Canis ex machina. The dogs of Kerfol represent independence, freedom, emotional agency, and affection, but above all, they symbolize the power of love and the quest for happiness for Anne de Barrigan, who experiences comfort, emotional support, and fidelity in a context of great fear, distress, and despair. At the same time, the dogs remind us of Anne as she's psychologically intimidated and mistreated. Eventually, the dog's ghosts haunt Kerfol through centuries, and they are the supernatural testimony of Cournot's tragedy and their revenge. In this sense, Jennifer Haytuck points out that, quote, the dogs experience the helplessness and terror of violent death, an emotional trauma that has left them caught between worlds, forever longing for and unable to experience human contact. They cannot speak their fear or pain at the time of their deaths or their loneliness afterward as ghosts. To Wharton, their experience of violence and muteness lies at the heart of the ghost story's meaning. On the other hand, the court is unable to explain the uncanny and cannot bring judgment to the haunting existence. Despite the trial, there is no recognition or resolution of the truth, and the dogs, symbolizing Anne's repression, continue to haunt the house in their strange, silent, and impassive way. In my view, the presence of the ghost dogs, or the supernatural, is an obvious source of terror, but the true menace arises from the oppression of violence against women, as well as the withholding of knowledge and power from them. The ghost dogs return from the grave to undermine the social injustices and remind a fundamental reality about the violence against women and animals. They are revengeful spirits, and they were really violent and ruthless in their slaying of Yves de Cournot. Quote, the dogs were snarling and panting. Once or twice they cried out. I think he moaned once. Then he was quiet and said to the court. The ghost dogs have subjectivity and agency as they are able to revenge their traumatic death. But at the same time, it is important to remember that they could not speak out their distress and pain when they were strangled by Yves de Cournot. When I got there, it was quite dark. I found my husband's flint and steel and struck a spark. I saw him lying there. He was dead. Anne de Cournot, quote, was finally handed over to the keeping of her husband's family, who shut her up in the keep of Kerfol, where she is said to have died many years later, a harmless mad woman. We might conclude that Kerfol exposes the horrors of living in a patriarchal culture, the oppression of women through domestication, the withholding of power and knowledge from women, and their powerlessness within a violent and cruel patriarchal home. As I have argued in this lecture, Wharton suggests that Western culture devalues dogs as much as women, and to her, both oppressions are equally troubling. Kerfol is a ghost story in which the role of the ghost dogs play in the development of Anne de Barrigan's trial is the spectacle of the repressed. I would also like to stress that they have a very revealing affective role in the story, and perhaps what is more relevant in our analysis is that they eventually become the Canis ex machina, which symbolizes a kind of supernatural intervention to punish the cruel executor. Finally, I would like to highlight that in this story, Wharton portrays many tensions, dichotomies, or conflicts between past and present, reality and fantasy, visible and invisible, old and young, hatred and love, rational and emotional in the context of the Cournot's home. It is well known that in Gothic stories, the depiction of home as a space of violence becomes a symbol I call the domestic Gothic. Far from being a safe haven for Anne de Barrigan and her dogs, the Gothic home or castle is a space of fear, terror, violence, exhaustion, domination, subordination, oppression, humiliation, revenge, and eventually death. The role of ghost dogs and dogs in this violent home is twofold. On the one hand, to expose the horrors of the Gothic villain who killed them, and on the other hand, to be providers of emotional comfort and protection from Anne de Barrigan. In this context of tensions and emotional conflicts, Wharton depicts how emotions circulate between the characters' bodies, human and animal, and how their emotional lives expose a complex image of patriarchal society, In the end, the American writer brilliantly represents how affects are fundamental aspects of human and animal existence, and how social and cultural contingencies can influence the way in which her main characters experience and express them. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be glad to, well, to have a kind of dialogue about this story, or if you have questions or observations or anything you would like to say, I'll be glad to answer them. I'm going to okay, I'm going to skip this so that you can see me. But let's see if I can do it. Dejar de compartir. There we go. Okay.
Thank you very much for extremely interesting story and presentation of the text. Maybe we not very many Ukrainian readers are familiar with this excellent work of literature, and I invite our guests, our virtual guests, to ask questions. I have prepared some questions, but I would like to give the floor to the guests first.
Okay, I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Please, dear colleagues, if you have questions, go ahead.
I haven't read the summary of the story because I assume that you all had read it, okay?
Okay, so maybe I can start with questions. You see, when I was reading the short story, I was asking myself whether the narrator is a man or a woman. You said unnamed, but I don't know.
You mean the narrator?
The narrator, yeah, the narrator.
Well,
in your opinion, is this the man's voice or the woman's voice?
Oh my God, that's a really, really difficult question. And this is something we always discuss in our classes. It is not so clear. Let me give you an example. On page 2, we know that the narrator is a visitor to Kerfol as a prospective purchaser, right? And he's an ancestor of Hervé de Larrivan, one of the protagonists of the story. On the second page, the narrator says, I sat down on a stone and lit a cigarette. As soon as I had done it, it struck me as a puerile and portentous thing to do, with a great blind house looking down at me. So if we that's a good guessing. Your question is excellent. If we guess, or if you fantasize about this narrator smoking a cigarette before the Great War, we might guess this narrator might be a man, okay? Or we have a male narrator. But sometimes I also have the feeling that the narrator is a woman. So there are some hints that might inform us about the narrator's gender, but it is very hard to determine. What about you, Alexander? How do you? What were your guessings?
in my opinion, that's the voice sounds like more female than male.
Okay.
Because it's sympathetic, and of course it's just, I don't know, I imagined a very intellectual woman who wrote this who tells this story. And but I agree with you that it is difficult to decide, and maybe it was done on purpose, because I want to ask a second question about the narrator. You see, I think this the narrator brings an ironic perspective in the text. This I think so, because there is a third protagonist in the short story. It's a love triangle, and the young gentleman, who lives not far from the place where the heroine lives. And so at the very end of this short story, we have a wonderful joke, in my opinion. You see, the narrator says, you see, this young gentleman, he becomes something like a monk, in the in the Protestant cloister, but at least, he was able to experience two wonderful things in his life: a romantic love, and probably he could talk to Pascal.
That's right.
It's the very end of the short story, and I admire this ending that brings, it's a kind of joke. You see, it's a wonderful, sophisticated joke that makes me think that the whole story is written in a little bit in ironic mode.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. As for what you were saying before, great guessings. Yes, because what is obvious, let me go back to what you said before, is that the narrator is sympathetic to Anne de Barrigan. That's pretty obvious. So it might be also a female voice. Why not? As for what you have said as the outcome of the story, I think that there is an ironic turning point here, because in fact, the Hervé de Larrivan follows the steps of Armand Andilly, who was a monk in a monastic community, and who followed the Jansenism, which was a kind of Catholic theological movement, pretty similar, in my view, to the Calvinist movements of the Protestant, during Calvin's revolution, we could say, Protestant revolution. So yes, I think it has a very important ironic tone. We are never sure about whether Anne de Barrigan, our protagonist, has in fact an affair with Hervé de Larrivan. It seems that they were very close. It seems that they had a great friendship, and in fact, Hervé de Larrivan was the only person who really offered a kind of emotional sustain to Anne de Barrigan, who lived a solitary life in the castle, as a prisoner. Something else that I haven't mentioned in my talk is that some American writers, and I think that Edith Wharton's Gothic stories are completely different to her wonderful novels like The Age of Innocence, which are very much focused on the bourgeois American society. I think that in the Gothic stories, she really focuses on the ills of patriarchal society, though she veils them with the supernatural and the use of the Gothic mansion, like in this case, and she goes back to the 16th century. I think that she's addressing some of the issues of American society, especially those related to the situation of women. Okay.
Yeah, and maybe the last question, also connected with this ironic perspective. You see, when I was reading the short story, you see, I was thinking about possible intertextual links with the references with the French literature. Actually, in my opinion, it's very much like a new version of the Beauty and the Beast, because I read that the author, the lady who wrote The Beauty of the Beast, actually she wrote about herself. And her situation was very much like the situation of the protagonist of the short story. She had to marry a man who was, I mean, the author of The Beauty and the Beast. And so she married a man who was something like 60. And our male protagonist is 63, 64, you know, and she was something like 17. And this experience of being, you know, actually in prison, completely dependent on the old sexual maniac, you see, and then she rewrote this story in a very decent way to tell about this actually living like this is madness. Yeah, is madness. Is it possible that Edith Wharton plays with these intertextual references?
Well, to tell you the truth, I haven't thought about that, but thank you for bringing that connection, that intertextual connection. The problem is that in the case of Kerfol, the Gothic villain is really, really cruel. I mean, he kills almost all the dogs at Kerfol, at least 4 of them. He strangles them as a kind of warning against his wife. No, remember that they are childless, that he's frustrated because he doesn't have an inheritor, an offspring. I don't know, because in the case of the Beauty and the Beast turns out to be a real good guy, no? Very friendly eventually. But I mean, Yves Cornor is a prototypical Gothic villain, no doubt about that. He's really, really cruel. He's unable to show any kind of sympathy towards his wife, and above all, jealousy is one of his main problems. No, he's really obsessed and he's sick, really, by the effects of those emotions that make him be more than cruel, in the sense that he keeps his wife isolated from the external world. She has no contact whatsoever with the external world. So this is a prototypical closed space in the Gothic. In Gothic literature, we also have certain parameters or paradigms, and this is one of the paradigms, no? To be in the closed space, to be a prisoner in this closed space, which is a place of above all of extreme fear. No, so I don't know if she read this story, to tell you the truth, but I'll try to find out, because I think it is a good question.
I think it's just a kind of universal situation if we speak about young women dependent on the just maybe say old rich man and having no choice and living in complete loneliness. Yeah, this is even more terrible than tortures. Okay, thank you for your answers. Please, dear colleagues and friends, I invite you to ask questions or to comment. Okay, please.
I see that there are some students from the Autónoma have joined us, no? So if you have any questions.
Okay, so then if our friends and colleagues do not want to ask questions, the only thing I have to do is to thank you for an extremely profound and interesting interpretation of the short story, because it's so important to pay attention to these elements, in my opinion. You say actually it is an excursion not only to the history of emotions, but it's an excursion to the everyday life. How the everyday life is connected, yeah, to the emotions. And I was also thinking, and I invite all our participants of the discussion to think about the importance of dogs, for example, in our life, because dogs appear at a certain moment in the civilization. We think that they are so. They are with us and do the same thing all centuries of the history of the humankind. But, you know, in different times, dogs play different parts, and the parts they play, they reflect our emotions. Thank you very much for extremely interesting presentation, and
Thank you, Alexander.
bringing us to the world of Edith Wharton. Thank you.
I would like to, yes, to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be here today with you all. I send you all my affection and my emotional support, because we all love you in Spain, and we would like you to overcome these terrible circumstances. But we all know also that you are very strong, and you will overcome this this period of sorrow. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nos veremos en Madrid.
Nos veremos en Madrid. I'm sure about that. I'm sure I'll see you in Madrid, and we'll share moments of affection.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.